The organs of the urinary system help work together to remove waste products from the blood and help maintain homeostasis. The organs of the urinary system are the kidneys, the ureters, urinary bladder, and the urethra. The kidneys filter waste products into the bloodstream to convert it into urine, and the ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra are collectively known as the urinary tract because they transport the urine out of the body. So the main function of the urinary system is to remove waste products from the bloodstream, but also to store urine, which urine is continuously produced, and the urinary bladder is an expandable muscular sac that can store as much as 1 liter of urine. Another function is to excrete urine, which the urethra transports urine from the urinary bladder and expels it to the outside of the body. Another function is to regulate blood volume, and the kidneys control the volume of interstitial fluid and blood under the direction of certain hormones. And so changes in blood volume affect blood pressure, and so the kidneys indirectly affect blood pressure. We also have the regulation of red blood cell production, and so as the kidneys filter the blood, they are indirectly measuring the oxygen level in the blood. If the blood oxygen levels are reduced, erythropoietin acts on stem cells in the bone marrow to increase erythrocyte production to help increase transport of more oxygen. And the last function is to regulate ion balance and acid-base balance. And so the kidneys help control the blood's inorganic ion balance, such as sodium ions, potassium ions, and phosphate ions, and also maintaining the acid-base balance by altering rates of hydrogen and ammonium secretion, as well as bicarbonate reabsorption. The kidneys are two symmetrical, bean-shaped, reddish-brown organs located along the posterior abdominal wall, lateral to the vertebral column. The superior extremity of the left kidney is at the level of the T12 vertebrae, and the inferior extremity is at the level of L3 vertebrae. The superior extremity of the right kidney is about 2 centimeters inferior to the superior pole of the left kidney due to the large size of the liver. Both kidneys have an adrenal gland that rests on the superior extremity of each kidney. The kidney has a concave medial border called the hilum or hilus, and this is where blood vessels, nerves, and the ureter connect to the kidney. The hilum is continuous with an internal space within each kidney called the renal sinus. The renal sinus houses the renal arteries, the renal veins, lymph vessels, nerves, and the renal pelvis, the renal calyces, and variable amounts of adipose tissue. The fibrous capsule, or the renal capsule, is composed of dense irregular connective tissue that covers the outer surface of the kidneys. The fibrous capsule maintains the kidney's shape, protects it from trauma, and also prevents infectious pathogens from entering the kidney. When a kidney is sectioned along a coronal plane, an outer renal cortex and an inner renal medulla can be seen. The medulla tends to be a darker shade than the cortex, and extensions of the cortex, called the renal columns, project into the medulla and subdivide the medulla into renal pyramids. An adult kidney typically contains 8 to 15 renal pyramids. The tip of the renal pyramid projects into a funnel-shaped space called the minor calyx. There are between 8 to 15 minor calyces, where one minor calyx for each renal pyramid. Several minor calyces merge to form larger spaces called major calyces, where each kidney typically contains 2 to 3 major calyces. Urine from the renal pyramids is collected by the minor calyces and then drained into the major calyces. The major calyces merge to form a large funnel-shaped renal pelvis, which collects urine and transports it into the ureter. Since the kidney's primary function is to filter blood, at least 20 to 25% of resting cardiac output normally flows through the kidneys. Blood is carried to a kidney in a renal artery, which generally arises and extends from the lateral region of the descending abdominal aorta at the level of the first or second lumbar vertebrae. Up to 5 segmental arteries branch from the renal artery within the renal sinus. While still in the renal sinus, the segmental arteries further branch to form the interlobar arteries. Interlobar arteries travel through the renal columns where they branch to form arcuate arteries. These arcuate arteries project parallel to the base of the medullary pyramid and give off branches into interlobular arteries that project peripherally into the cortex. As the interlobular arteries enter the cortex, they extend small branches called afferent arterioles, then enter a structure called the renal corpuscle and forms a capillary network called the glomerulus. Some blood plasma is filtered through the glomerulus into the capsular space within the renal corpuscle. Once some of the blood plasma has been filtered, the remaining blood leaves the glomerulus and enters an efferent arteriole. The efferent arteriole branches into one of 2 types of capillary networks, peritubular capillaries or vasa recta. The peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta are responsible for the actual exchange of gases, nutrients, and waste materials within the kidneys. The peritubular capillaries are associated with the convoluted tubules and primarily reside in the cortex of the kidney. The vasa recta are associated with the nephron loop and reside primarily in the medulla of the kidney. The peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta then drain into a network of veins, and the smallest of these veins are the interlobular veins, which travel alongside the interlobular arteries. The interlobular veins merge to form arcuate veins that project parallel to the base of each medullary pyramid, and then merge to form interlobar veins that travel through the renal columns towards the renal sinus. Interlobular veins merge in the renal sinus to form the renal vein, and the renal vein leaves the kidney at its hilum and transverse horizontally to drain into the inferior vena cava. Blood filtration occurs at the glomerulus, and the blood remains highly oxygenated until it reaches the peritubular capillaries and vasa recta, where gas exchange occurs. The functional unit of the kidney is the nephron, and it is composed of a renal corpuscle, a proximal convoluted tubule, a nephron loop, and a distal convoluted tubule. Both kidneys house approximately 2.5 million nephrons, and where they measure less than 5 centimeters in total length. There are 2 types of nephrons, cortical nephrons and juxtamedullary nephrons. 85% of the nephrons are cortical nephrons because the bulk of nephrons resides solely in the cortex, and the relatively short nephron loops just barely penetrate the medulla. 15% of nephrons are juxtamedullary nephrons, where their long nephron loops extend deep into the medulla. Nephrons aid in urine formation by 3 different steps. The first is filtration, which is the process where water and some dissolved solutes in the blood plasma passively move out of the glomerulus into the capsular space of the renal corpuscle due to pressure differences across the filtration membrane. This water is dissolved, and its dissolved solutes are called filtrate. The next step is tubular reabsorption, and this is when substances in the filtrate move by diffusion or active transport across the wall of the renal tubules to return to the blood. Once filtrate begins to be modified, it is called tubular fluid, and usually all needed solutes and most water that form the filtrate are absorbed by the blood. As reabsorption occurs, some excess solutes, water, and waste products remain within the tubular fluid. The last step is tubular secretion, and this is active transport of solutes out of the blood into the tubular fluid. Once the fluid exits the collecting duct, it is urine, and urine consists of solutes and water that have been filtered as filtrate and secreted into the tubular fluid. The renal corpuscle is an enlarged bulbous region of the nephron, and it has two different structures: the thick tangle of capillaries, which is the glomerulus, and an epithelial capsule surrounding the glomerulus, which is the glomerular capsule or the Bowman's capsule. As blood flows through the glomerulus, the solutes and water within the blood are filtered from the glomerulus into the capsular space. Part of the reason of filtration occurring at the glomerulus is due to the afferent arteriole being wider in diameter than the efferent arteriole, so the blood in the afferent arteriole enters the glomerulus under high pressure, which helps filter the plasma and solutes out of the glomerulus. At times, too much water, vital nutrients, ions, plasma proteins, and vitamins escape into the filtrate. Therefore, the renal tubule, which is the proximal convoluted tubule, nephron loop, and distal convoluted tubule, are responsible for refining the modified process of this filtration. So, the proximal convoluted tubule is lined by simple cuboidal epithelium and tall microvilli that increase its reabsorption capacity. And so it actively reabsorbs almost all nutrients, such as glucose and amino acids, ions, specifically and especially sodium, vitamins, and any plasma proteins from the tubular fluid. Approximately 60 to 65% of the water in the tubular fluid is reabsorbed by osmosis. The reabsorbed solutes and the water enter the blood into the peritubular capillaries and are returned into general circulation. The nephron loop, or loop of Henle, originates at the sharp bend of the proximal convoluted tubule and projects internally toward the medulla. The descending limb of the nephron loop extends from the cortex towards the medulla, and the ascending limb returns back to the renal cortex. The function of the nephron loop is to facilitate reabsorption of water and solutes from the tubular fluid. In the ascending limb, sodium and chloride ions are the primary solids that are reabsorbed, and when these materials are reabsorbed from the nephron loop, they are returned to the blood by the vasa recta capillary network. The distal convoluted tubule originates in the renal cortex at the end of the thick ascending limb of the nephron loop and contacts the afferent arteriole wall. The primary function of the distal convoluted tubule is to secrete ions such as potassium and hydrogen into tubular fluid. Reabsorption of water also occurs here under the influence of antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone. And these are secreted in response to low volumes or low solute concentrations in the tubular fluid with the kidneys. So these cause the distal convoluted tubule cells to increase water and sodium reabsorption from tubular fluid. Once the tubular fluid leaves the distal convoluted tubule, it enters the collecting tubules. And so with alcohol, these actually disrupt these hormones within the distal convoluted tubule, and so water is not reabsorbed anymore by the distal convoluted tubule and is just excreted. And so that's why a lot of times when you have an excess of alcohol, you also become severely dehydrated. When the tubular fluid leaves the distal convoluted tubules, it must travel through a series of small collecting tubules that empty into collecting ducts. Collecting tubules and collecting ducts project through the renal medulla towards the renal papilla. The collecting ducts are the last structure that have the capacity to modify the tubular fluid further and do so under the hormone influence of antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone in the same capacity as it did in the distal convoluted tubule. Once the tubular fluid leaves the collecting duct, it is called urine, and the remaining structures of the kidney simply transport the urine and cannot modify this fluid further. Several collecting ducts merge to empty into a papillary duct that opens at the edge of the renal papilla into a minor calyx, which then transports the urine to major calyces, which in turn transports the urine to the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis conducts urine into the ureter. The ureters are long fibromuscular tubes that conduct urine from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. They originate at the renal pelvis as it exits the hilum of the kidney and then extends inferiorly to enter the posterior lateral wall of the base of the urinary bladder. There are three tunics, where the first and innermost tunic has transitional epithelium that is distensible or stretchy, and it is impermeable to the passage of urine. And so this is important so that it can expand when it has an excess of urine that will flow through it, and then it can revert back to its original shape. The urinary bladder is an expandable muscular container that serves as a reservoir for urine. The bladder is positioned immediately posterior to the pubic symphysis. In females, the urinary bladder is anterior-inferior to the uterus and directly anterior to the vagina. In males, the bladder is anterior to the rectum and superior to the prostate gland. When empty, the urinary bladder exhibits an upside-down pyramidal shape. The lining of the urinary bladder is transitional epithelium that accommodates the shape changes that occur with distension and is highly vascularized. The ureters enter the posterior lateral wall of the urinary bladder through the oblique urethral openings, and the constricted neck of the bladder is located inferiorly and connects to the urethra. The posterior inferior triangular area of the urinary bladder wall is called the trigone and is formed by imaginary lines connecting the two urethral openings and the urethral opening. The trigone does not move and remains in place as the urinary bladder fills and evacuates. It functions as a funnel to direct the stored urine into the urethra as the bladder wall contracts. One other particular area within the lumen of the urinary bladder is the rugae, and this allows for even greater distension, and it is due to the increase in mucosal folds that we find within the urinary bladder. The urethra is a fibromuscular tube that originates at the neck of the urinary bladder and conducts urine into the exterior of the body. There are two urethral sphincters that restrict the release of urine until pressure within the urinary bladder is high enough and voluntary activities needed to release the urine are activated. The internal urethral sphincter is the involuntary superior sphincter surrounding the neck of the bladder where the urethra originates, and it is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. The external urethral sphincter is inferior to the internal urethral sphincter and is formed by skeletal muscle fibers. It's a voluntary sphincter that is controlled by the somatic nervous system, and once we become potty trained, this is when we have learned to control that muscle. There are several differences between the male and the female urethra. The female urethra has only one function, and that is to transport urine to the exterior of the body, and it is only 3 to 5 centimeters in length and opens to the outside of the body at the external urethral orifice. The male urethra has two main functions. It serves as a urinary and a reproductive function because it serves as a passageway for both urine and semen, but not at the same time. It is a lot longer, where it's 18 to 20 centimeters in length, and it's separated into 3 different portions. The superiormost portion is the prostatic urethra, and it is approximately 3 to 4 centimeters in length, and it is the most dilatable portion of the urethra. It extends through the prostate gland immediately inferior to the male bladder. The second portion, the membranous urethra, is the shortest and least dilatable portion of the male urethra, and it extends from the inferior surface of the prostate gland through the urogenital diaphragm. And the last portion, the most distal portion, is the spongy urethra, and it is the longest, averaging about 15 centimeters in length. It is encased with a cylinder of erectile tissue in the penis called the corpus spongiosum and extends to the external urethral orifice, where semen and urine are both exit the body. The expulsion of urine from the bladder is called micturition, or urination, and micturition is initiated by a complex sequence of events called the micturition reflex. The bladder is supplied by both the parasympathetic and sympathetic axons of the autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic axons are from the spinal cord segments of S2 to S4, where we have the relaxation of the urethral sphincters, and the sympathetic axons are formed from T11 to L2 segments of the spinal cord, and these cause contraction of the internal urethral sphincters.